Harbour has been a world-class naval base, an industrial hub, and for millions of immigrants, the last glimpse of Ireland they would ever see. As a geographer, it's the islands that dot this harbour that interest me. And this might just be the most important of them all, Spike Island, sometimes known as Ireland's Alcatraz. I've come to the speck in the sea to see how this island had a role in defending an empire and building Ireland. In this series, our team, an engineer, an architect and a geographer, is exploring some of the finest examples of Ireland's building and engineering heritage. And this time, we're exploring an island fortress that became an island prison. Cork Harbour and its islands have played a pivotal role in Irish maritime history, and the architecture of Cove is part of that story, as architect Orla Murphy is finding out.
I'm going to venture behind this elegant Victorian facade to find out how Cove became a place of wealth and privilege.
And engineer Tim Joyce will explore one of the last fully bastioned, star-shaped fortresses to be built in Europe.
I'm here to see how cutting-edge military engineering turned this little island into a deadly defensive position.
Spike Island is a small place with a rich history. These days, visitors can come and go as they please, not like in the 1980s and 90s, when Spike detained young offenders, some of whom infamously rioted and destroyed almost half the complex. The Irish Defence Forces, and most significantly the British military, have also left their mark here. War and imprisonment are the two great themes in the story of the ancient Inish Pic, from where we get the name Spike Island. The island itself is less than a kilometre long and barely half a kilometre wide. Before the Royal Navy got its hands on it, this place would have looked totally different. Wild, rugged, full of craggy mounds. In the late 18th century, Spike was the fulcrum in a system of defensive fortifications, which had Fort Camden on the west side of the harbour and Fort Carlisle on the east, providing cover fire against any invading fleet attempting to breach the Cove's channel. The Spanish Armada, the American War of Independence, and the 1796 French landing at Bantry Bay had all put fears of invasion at fever pitch. Spike Island would require significant reinforcement. The key to understanding the importance of the harbour and this island to the British Empire is its strategic location. Irish military historian and author Tom O'Neill has worked here for over 25 years, and he's showing me the significance of a harbour that could shelter over 400 ships at any one time. Tom, for such a small little island, why did Spike become so important?
First of all, because of its position within the inner harbour. It actually reinforced the harbour in conjunction with the other forts further south. But that was local. But international then, the Cork Harbour is ideally positioned to become almost an outpost for security for the southwestern approaches for the west coast of England and Wales. In Europe, the Napoleonic threat was the big one, and Ireland was always seen as a potential backdoor where an enemy would attempt to use it as a base in which to invade the western side of England. The other thing then, why in here? Well, we're defending what in effect is the second largest natural harbour anywhere in the world for what was at the time the largest navy in the world. And we're protecting the ships that were lying at anchor because in the early days they were sail-powered and could not manoeuvre to protect themselves. And then later when they became steam-powered, again, the larger they were, the more helpless they were because the steam was the source of power not just to propel the vessel, but also to operate the massive guns.
The peril from enemy fleets storming the harbour was taken very seriously. But it was one thing to recognise the danger. You had to be able to stop it as well. Engineer Tim Joyce is stepping back in time to find out exactly how Spike Island would have coped with an invasion in the Empire's backyard.
This is actually the third fortress to be built here. It took the Royal Navy quite a while to figure out exactly what they wanted to do with the island. The legacy they've left behind is one of ruthless military efficiency. Construction began in 1804 and Fort Westmoreland, as we know today, took over 60 years to build. The engineers had shaved the top off the island and used the quarried limestone to construct this military megastructure. Because of its shape, this type of fortification is known as a star fort. The 6 bastions, as they're called, jut out to allow gun placements protect the fort from all sides. And if you were brave enough to set foot on the island, you'd be at the mercy of this deadly design. You see, it wasn't just the fort that was re-engineered. The entire island was turned into one big killing zone. The fort was surrounded by a deep, dry moat with a steep slope beyond. It's a type of artificial slope known as a glacis. Just flat enough to tempt invaders, but too steep for them to climb at speed. If you got as far as the moat, you would have to contend with shot and shell raining down from the ramparts. It's hard to imagine how a 19th century soldier could get anywhere near these walls, let alone overrun them. The man behind this deadly engineering was General Charles Valency, a military strategist obsessive about protecting the kingdom from invasion. The enemies of the empire changed from one century to the next, and more importantly, military technology changed dramatically. Longer range and more accurate guns posed new threats, but Spike Island retained its tactical role in coastal defence. I met with Commander Brian Fitzgerald of the Irish Naval Service to learn more. What's the strategy behind this coastal defence?
Well, as you can see, Tim, with the high ground to the west, high ground to the east and the island in the centre, the arcs of fire that you can deliver around Cork Harbour in and of itself makes the harbour impenetrable. This was about providing a coastal defence over the approaches to Cork Harbour so that the guns here would outrange any ship that might try and approach the harbour and force their way in. So the range of these guns can extend anywhere between 4 and 12 miles. And also what you have is, because of the arrangement of the harbour, the lookout information that would flow from the wider areas of Cork Harbour into the gun emplacement so that angles and arcs of fire could be worked out in order that the accuracy of the shot from here could be sufficient to deter the enemy. It is quite an extraordinary example of this type of coastal defence. It was the British here to stay. They were going to defend the approaches to the British Isles and to Europe, and the place they chose to take that stand was here in Cork Harbour, and they fought like hell to keep it even after the independence of this country.
Forts like this were common throughout the British Empire, and Fort Westmoreland really is a fine example of the single-minded practical engineering that used the most up-to-date military technology from the turn of the 19th century. I'm in the Forts magazine, buried deep underground to protect ammunition from enemy shells. But you couldn't light a naked flame in there without sending the whole place sky high. So they built this rat run of a gallery with niches so that this lamp could light the stores. That's really neat engineering.
By the mid-19th century, fear of invasion was on the wane, but the threat of Irish nationalism was on the rise. Fears began to shift from external conflict to internal security, and with that shift Spike Island found a new purpose. During the 1840s, Spike Island became a sort of penal colony, housing everyone from political prisoners to the homeless, victims of the vagrancy laws that were enacted at the height of the famine. Archaeologists from University College Cork are excavating inside the fortress walls, hoping to shed new light on Ireland's place in the empire. Dr. Bara O'Donovan is directing the research.
Bara.
Hi, Susan.
Lovely
Welcome
to meet
Spike.
you. Thank you very much. So what are you excavating here?
Well, this small excavation here is on the site of what was known as the wooden prison or the timber prison. By 1850, we had about 2,500 men imprisoned here, and there wasn't accommodation for those numbers. So this wooden prison was designed to take 200 men. But when it came here to Spike, there was a problem with overcrowding, and it ended up accommodating almost instantly, like the minute it opened, it had 400 men. Now, we could read that in a number of ways. You could see it as being just indicative of how difficult the situation was here locally with the overcrowding of this prison. But I think also we have to take into account, like when we read, say, the annual reports of the people running the prison system, there is a kind of racialized conceptualization of the Irish convict that runs through that.
What was that perception? What did they think of the Irish?
Well, for example, one of the things that's mentioned in those documents is that you could not educate the Irish prisoner. In the prison system in England, there was, they were teaching the prisoners crafts and trades and so on, so that when they left prison they would be able to apply these. But in the early years of the use of the prison here in Spike, the convict prison, there is a mention of, well, these men are not really suitable for learning trades, and that they're best employed as labourers.
So hence, therefore, they start building things.
Well, they're used to move tons and tons of soil in the construction of the fort.
So they were building an empire, literally?
Yeah, absolutely. And they were also populating that empire. They were building a working class in places like Tasmania by taking men and women from places like this and moving them there.
That's fascinating.
This is like social engineering.
The harsh conditions in the prison here on Spike stood in stark contrast to the Victorian splendour of Cove on the other side of Cork Harbour.
The Cove of Cork was transformed in the 19th century from seaside village to prosperous town, and I want to explore some of the stories behind its residential Victorian architecture. The town of Cove we know today is a legacy of the social and economic shifts that followed in the wake of the famine. As the economy began to recover, a new, prosperous middle class came to the fore, leaving the squalor of the cities behind for the fresh air of rural Ireland. And Cove, with its Royal Navy connections, was perfectly placed to take advantage of that boom. Despite its naval tradition, not everything in Cork Harbour is shipshape and uniform. Because of the topography, most of the terraces are built parallel to the slope. But in this one, known locally as the Deck of Cards, each colourful house steps its way up the steep hill. Of all Cove's elegant Victorian terraces, the Crescent was and remains the most sought after. This exclusive row of 13 Italian-style villas gives an insight into Cove's burgeoning status in the middle of the 19th century. What faces the sea are actually the back gardens, with the front doors around the other side. The outer form of the terrace responds to the contours of the landscape and the views out over the bay. But the interiors of these houses are just as interesting and can tell us more about how society and the way people lived in the mid to late 19th century was rapidly changing. For a closer look inside, I've arranged to meet Mona Hallinan, the Architectural Conservation Officer with Cork County Council. This is fantastic. The bay window looking out over the harbour is absolutely gorgeous.
It is, yeah. They have the best view, certainly, in Cove.
Definitely. And who were the houses built for?
Primarily the houses would have been built for the flourishing middle classes. You would have had those who were involved in the shipping trade and the transatlantic trade and the provision trade. The Navy were also here, so you still would have had their high-ranking officers based in Cove.
So quite elite, I suppose.
Very elite, very, very elite. And I think the way these places are designed reflects that. I mean, the Crescent itself can be seen from everywhere in Cove, and it's overlooking the entire harbour. So it gives an idea of the high status of the people that lived here.
The Crescent was developed by Viscount Middleton in 1850, and the houses were marketed to prospective buyers with a brochure, one of the first such property development schemes in Ireland. And there's another first about these houses that Mona is going to show me. So the stairs works in the centre of the house, with the rooms with the view, obviously,
yeah.
and to the rear, yeah. And then we have this little room. What's that?
Yes, we do. This is the toilet. So we have these in all the houses in the terraces.
The Crescent has the somewhat unusual distinction of being one of the first housing developments in Ireland with an indoor upstairs flush toilet included in the design. Quite an innovation for the Victorian middle-class property owner.
This is the first time you're seeing all of these things being built within the house, so the design of the house is facilitating to take in these modern services, or what they consider to be modern services.
So it's actually, was it probably a huge change in terms of the house, but also of the town and how society was changing?
Yes, and I mean, it's your early form of infrastructure works. You know, things that we're actually still doing today, we're improving on those initial infrastructure works. So it would have been a massive, I suppose, resources put into engineering and large-scale infrastructure to facilitate a lot of these modern conveniences.
As it grew in prosperity and popularity, the town developed from a port into a Victorian seaside resort. And when the train station opened in 1862, day trippers from Cork City contributed to its economy. Cove got the Royal Seal of Approval and a new name, Queenstown, with the visit of Queen Victoria. As they gazed out over the sea, the citizens of Cove must have been aware of the misery of life on Spike Island. But in truth, the harshness of the prisons and the splendour of Victorian Cove were really just two sides of the same coin.
Spike Island was a fort. It was never designed to hold prisoners. Life was hard for convicts, who were often forced to do building work and repairs. But the harshest treatment was reserved for individuals considered threats to the state. These cells were built in order to further punish the unruly. Confinement here was at the whim of the prison authorities. I'm exploring the punishment block with Cal McCarthy, who has done extensive research on the prison regime here on Spike.
There's much evidence when you look at the communications of the time that the government had little idea or understanding of the crisis that was unfolding in the shape of the famine. The convict depot was only supposed to be temporary, so anything that was built here was built to military standards and could be used later by the military. Indeed, in this punishment block, you can see the domed roofs in the cells. These cells are bomb-proof.
Spike Island was the largest prison that has ever existed in Britain or Ireland. But conditions for the 2,500 prisoners here were appalling. Between 1850 and 1854, 1,000 prisoners died. It was a shock to prison inspectors and led to calls for immediate reform and change. So was it forward-looking, do you think, as a prison system at the time?
At the time, I think it actually was, yes. The focus was becoming more about reform than punishment, and much of that, of course, was because they couldn't transport convicts anymore. So rather than shipping your problems to Australia, you knew you had to deal with your problems in Ireland or Britain, and you knew that when they were released, you would have to deal with these people in society. So the focus became about reforming them, and that, I suppose, was the focus of the Irish convict system at that time.
The Irish penal system initiated improvements at Spike Island that became the model for prison reform in Britain and around the world. Spike was, in a sense, a prisoner of its own geography. Its strategic location made it irresistible for military planners and prison authorities. But the island is also a repository for the human cost of the harsh conditions experienced here almost 150 years ago. Dr. Donovan's archaeological team from UCC are excavating an island graveyard. About 200 prisoners are buried here, dating from a period back in time when the death rate decreased from 1 prisoner a day to 1 prisoner a month.
Bara, why are you digging here?
Well, we're digging here in the graveyard because the historical sources that are available to us about Spike Island really tell us the story from the perspective of the authorities. What we're able to access here are the physical remains of the convicts themselves, and their physical remains, their skeletal remains, contain information about their lives before they came into the prison system, but also they give us information on the impact on their bodies of incarceration.
How were the people buried here? Was there any respect shown to them?
There certainly was. Like what we have here is almost like a military graveyard. We have a regimented series of graves, almost, with uniform distances between each grave, and they're at fairly uniform depths. Each individual is in a coffin, which came as a surprise to us, and we have individual single burials.
And did any of them have anything buried with them?
We do have some evidence of the convict uniforms, so we know that they were buried as convicts, that their prisoner identity followed them into the grave. But we also have a few small artefacts buried with some individuals. We've had 2 small crucifixes, we've had rosary beads.
More than 1,200 convicts were buried on Spike Island before it closed in 1883. In this graveyard, the majority of graves are unmarked. The few marked individual headstones here only have initials, a prison number and date of death. There are no names.
Remember, the graves are being dug and the coffins are being built by fellow prisoners because forced labour was part of this regime. One of the things that we've found here is that the coffins were painted, which would not have been necessary, and that's being done by fellow prisoners. And I see it as an attempt to confer, if you like, some dignity on this individual and say this person was worthwhile.
So one of the things that strikes me is the fact that you are now telling a story that perhaps has been maybe glossed over in history. What's your feeling about that?
Our goal is really to tell their story and to, bring it down to the level of the individual. And that's what we can do when we look at the skeletal remains, because we can talk about what was that individual's biography and tell that individual's story.
The strategic location of Spike Island proved vital to the British Navy, right up to the outbreak of World War II. The guns of Spike were required to protect the British fleet as they patrolled the southwestern approaches and the busiest shipping channel in Europe. When Spike Island came under the control of the Irish government in 1938, it was as though history just rewound the tape. The island continued to be used as a military fort until it became obsolete, after which it once again became a makeshift prison. The last prisoners left the island in 2004, when it was handed over to Cork County Council. For the first time since the 18th century, Spike Island had been able to shed its association with war and incarceration. Today, the voices of Spike Island, the stories of its inmates, soldiers and sailors, are finally being heard. The ferry from Cove brings curious visitors, not shackled prisoners bound for exile. But who knows what remains to be discovered beneath the soil of Ireland's Alcatraz.
Kilkenny Castle, rock of Norman rule and home to the House of Ormond for well over 500 years. From this magnificent building, the Ormonds shaped and influenced the history of this island and this city. Hewn from local limestone, the castle is an architectural wonder. But more than that, it's a story of 8 centuries of building Ireland.
In this series, our team, an engineer, an architect and a geographer, is exploring some of the finest examples of Ireland's building and engineering heritage. And this time, we are in the medieval city of Kilkenny.
There's been a castle on this site ever since Richard de Clare, better known as Strongbow, built a wooden structure here in 1172. He built with one priority in mind, defence. And this is an excellent defensive position on high ground, backing onto the River Nore.
Kilkenny has always been a city worth defending because of its wealth. And later, Susan Hegarty will be finding out more about the physical development of the city.
I'm exploring the warren of slips and lanes that makes Kilkenny unique. I'm trying to get a handle on the layout of this medieval city.
Engineer Tim Joyce will look at how Kilkenny's Georgian infrastructure has withstood the tests of time and the forces of nature.
In 1763, a catastrophic flood swept away the 2 bridges in the city and caused havoc throughout the county. Within weeks, bridge engineers were working to get Kilkenny city connected again.
The architecture of the castle reflects centuries of change, but its basic structure has stayed the same. By planting themselves on the hills above the city, the Anglo-Normans were standing their ground and very much here to stay. And stay they would for over 800 years.
The story of Kilkenny Castle is the story of a Norman family, the Butlers of the House of Ormond. It's an epic tale of wealth, war and rebellion spread over 8 centuries. The castle was remodelled to the fashions and ambitions of the times, evolving from a medieval fortress to a restoration chateau to an elegant stately home. It's a masterclass in architectural history, forever linked to its past. Quite literally in this case. This window has been scooped out of the medieval walls, and just look at how thick they are. Norman rule was far from secure at the time when this castle was built, and that's why there's 8 feet of solid stone between the castle within and the city without. A Norman castle with corner turrets and a curtain wall is rare in Ireland and was the great innovation in 13th century fortification. And this was no ugly lump of grey stone. Castles like this had their walls plastered over with bright colours, making them landmark symbols of power and prestige in the area.
Many medieval buildings would have been covered with a lime render. This white coating would have been used to protect the walls from the Irish climate, but it must also have made for a striking image. One medieval visitor to these shores described Irish castles as emerging from the landscape like dragon's teeth.
Heating limestone in a lime kiln reduced the stone to a white powder, which was then used to make a mortar that could be plastered on stone walls. At least, that's the theory.
Hello, Pat. Nice to meet you.
Pat Tallis is an expert in hot lime mortar.
Thank you. You're here working with lime render. What's the role of lime in the render mix?
Well, the lime is the binder. That's what keeps the granules, the sand and the cobbles and the other products together. That's what forms the structure of the wall, or that surrounds the stones, and in particular this product expands when it goes into the joint, so you get a better bind. There was lime kilns all over Ireland back in the 1400 and 1500s, and it was very much a sustainable product insofar as Ireland is built on limestone. We'll now be adding the water. You might like to take a hand at this point?
I'd love to, yes.
So we'll give you the best shovel we've got.
Thank you.
And so this stuff takes a lot of mixing.
So Pat, we're not adding any cement or cement products. This is the lime is doing the work of the cement in terms of adhering.
The lime is the king of this mix. That will begin to heat now in another little while. You just put your hand there and you'll feel how warm that is. You'll be surprised.
Oh, you really feel the heat coming off the mix.
Lovely on a frosty morning to warm the guys up for the tea time. So, Orla, this is the dovecote, medieval dovecote, and John is now going to show us how this product is applied.
So it's a lovely breathable layer, particularly for old buildings.
It's a breathable layer compatible with the material underneath. Its job is to protect the building, to protect the stone underneath. Remember, it's the structure and the stones that are precious, but a beautiful material to work with. Gives a beautiful finish, and more importantly, it enhances the lifespan of the building.
Aside from the immense walls, another defensive feature of Kilkenny Castle was its moat. But this one wasn't flooded with water, and recent research has revealed why.
The castle's moat was effectively a dry ditch, and we now know from archaeological excavations that people would have lived right around it. The moat was eventually filled in the 17th century to make way for this massive gateway. It's a monument to the wealth and the self-confidence of the butlers who presided over the city at the time.
Kilkenny is well known as a medieval city, and Susan is out to explore exactly what that means.
Kilkenny is laid out in typical Norman style, with a single thoroughfare built north to south and with smaller slips and lanes to the side. The slips are all on one side of Parliament Street, running down to the river as slipways for boats, with the lanes all leading to high ground, running up to the old medieval wall.
The city was defended by an extensive network of walls, gates and towers. But city walls are more than just about defence. They also define the boundaries of the city and allow authorities to place taxes and tariffs on those living within. If you were a merchant and wanted to sell your wares in Kilkenny, you could, provided you paid up. Norman control meant Norman rules, and that meant burgage plots. These were regimented plots of land that helped maintain a neat and orderly street front. If you wanted to expand your living space, you had three options. You could build up, you could build back, or you could start from scratch. But one man did all three.
This is Roath House on Parliament Street, home to one of the wealthiest and most powerful merchants in late 16th century Kilkenny.
John Roath and his wife Rose had a growing family. They had 11 children. And being a wealthy man, unsurprisingly, he decided he needed more space. So he built a second house in his back garden. But he didn't stop there. John went on to build a third house in his narrow plot of land.
The extent of the Roath property becomes clear when you see the garden, where the sights and smells of 16th century Kilkenny have been brought back to life, and where I met Grace Fegan, who manages Roath House as a visitor centre.
Grace, what was a burgage plot?
Well, a burgage plot is a unit of property that was granted to the burghers or the residents of the walled medieval town of Kilkenny. You can see by any of the older maps and even current maps, the layout was from the street front all the way back to the city wall, these long, narrow plots. It allowed the residents to have street frontage where they could trade. It also allowed them to then have these long gardens where they could grow food and grow fruit.
And who are the Roaths? Where did they come from?
The Roaths originally, they were Anglo-Norman settlers. They came from, I believe, around Lancashire, going way back. John Roath then built this house, the first house on the street front in 1594. And at the time, he was a very wealthy and very powerful merchant.
What is so special about the garden?
It's a real oasis in the middle of the city. But what's key about it is up until 2004, this was a car park, a yard, an OPW yard. So there were sheds, diesel tanks, vans being parked, all that kind of thing. But we knew the garden was underneath here. And we undertook a series of investigations, geophysical investigations, but also by analysing the soil, the pollen and the seeds, we were able to discover what kind of plants grew here, and that's what we were able to reconstruct. 8 years on, it's maturing and it's looking as close as possible as we can get it to how the Roaths would have enjoyed it.
If Roath House tells us how the great merchant families of Kilkenny once lived, then St Mary's Church shows their attitudes towards death and remembrance.
So this is the monuments room.
This 13th century church is being redeveloped as Kilkenny's medieval Mile Museum. Archaeologist Colleen O'Driscoll is showing me the funerary sculpture in one of the side chapels. This is where the dozen or so of the area's wealthy merchant families had their burial plots, and the Roaths are fairly prominent.
When we excavated, we took out the new floor, and lo and behold, the chapel of the Roths was here, perfectly preserved. And then down below the tombs, again, were burial vaults.
Oh, wow. This is amazing.
The discovery of the Roth burial vaults is an extraordinary result of the archaeological dig, and right at the heart of the new museum. A city was defined during the Middle Ages as a place with a castle and a cathedral, centres of secular and ecclesiastical power. That link between the cathedral and castle provides the concept for the medieval mile.
There are many towns and cities in Ireland that have medieval origin, but the layout has changed as the city has evolved and grown. Kilkenny is different. Not only has the medieval layout remained the same, but 12th century features are part of everyday life.
Now, with 800 years of Ormonds to contend with, it can be hard to tell exactly who's who. All those earls and dukes and marquises tend to blur into one after a while. But if one character stands out from the pack, it's this man, James Fitzthomas Butler, the first Duke of Ormond. James was a complex figure. He was the first of the Butler dynasty to be raised as a Protestant, but he also spoke Irish. He led the royalist forces in Ireland when Cromwell invaded in 1649. Ultimately, though, James was unable to prevent Cromwell's forces tearing through Ireland. When Cromwell reached Kilkenny, the city was already racked with plague and barely able to defend itself. His artillery punched a hole in the wall of the castle, and his men poured through the breach. With the restoration of the monarchy, there was no plan to rebuild the castle as a defensive structure. The Ormonds regained their status under Charles II, but priorities had changed, and no more would the castle be hidden from view. From now on, it would be flaunted as a symbol of the wealth and prestige being generated by the merchants and tradesmen in the city below. And a busy city depends on stable infrastructure, as Tim is finding out.
When a city expands across a river, bridges are pivotal for its growth and development. Any threat to those bridges is a threat to the city. Kilkenny Castle sits on the River Nore, which, along with the Suir and the Barrow, make up the so-called Three Sisters. The Nore has a history of bursting its banks. Not good news for the city of Kilkenny. By far the most dramatic event in the city's history happened in October 1763, when, after 2 days of incessant rain, catastrophic flooding washed away both Greensbridge and Johnsbridge, killing 16 people in the process. The Greensbridge we see today is essentially the structure that was built after the apocalyptic storm in the 1760s. But you can still see the foundations of the original bridge that connected the old medieval road. Even though they had to build it in a hurry, what I love is that they did it with a flourish of style. The design copied the Palladian architecture of the Roman bridge at Rimini, but only on the city side. The other has no carved stonework at all. Practically all of the county's bridges were destroyed in the Great Flood, including those at Castlecomer, Bennett's Bridge, Graignamanagh and Thomastown. New bridges would require the best engineering, so Kilkenny engineer George Smith was called in to find solutions. Rebuilding Inishtig Bridge drew on all of Smith's skill and experience. Inishtig Bridge is the last crossing point on the Nore. It's the only bridge in Europe with 10 arches of equal span, and the 10th arch is what sets it apart. Its job was to let the Kilkenny-Inishtig Canal run through. I wanted to know more about this bridge and about how Smith tackled the job. So I'm meeting James Powell, a conservation consultant. James, this is a really fine bridge. How would they have built a bridge like this back in the day?
Well, the most likely way they would have built this would have been to essentially divide the river in two, but build a wall, essentially, a timber wall, which would be called a cofferdam. And once they'd completed that side, they would then divert the river through the other side and start again over there. So using cofferdams, they could work on the bottom of the river. And the designer of this bridge, George Smith, had recently been working with the famous George Semple in Dublin, building Essex Bridge, where they, I think, possibly for the first time, they used cofferdams to build that bridge. So he possibly learnt that there and brought it here.
This is a really impressive bridge.
Yes, it's a little plain this side, though. If we go and have a look at the other side, you'll see that there's a lot more impressive design on that side.
Oh, I'll have to have a look at that.
Okay.
The canal was never built, but the arch remains as a handy shortcut to the other side. It is a lot more impressive this side, definitely.
It's a bit better, isn't it? It's worth coming and having a look.
Yeah.
Much more interesting stonework, nicely carved cornice all the way along, little pilasters with Palladian design, giving a much more classical look to the whole thing.
But why put the money here? Why put this beautiful display this side? Why not the town side?
Well, you've got to remember who was possibly paying for this, and certainly who would have had the influence locally would have been the Tighe family up here in Woodstock House, where this would have formed part of the designed landscape that was their garden, as it were.
What all of these bridges demonstrate is the value of a piece of everyday engineering we take for granted, but which made our ancestors' lives a hell of a lot easier and is still of absolute value today.
By the time James Butler was made Duke of Ormond and Knight of the Garter in 1661, the old feudal castle was renovated in the style of an elegant French chateau. The most up-to-date furniture and paintings were acquired, but for the great Duke to really express his importance, one interior feature was essential.
Owning tapestries was the 17th century equivalent of owning a Ferrari or a luxury yacht. It was a real symbol of status and prestige.
Woven from linen, silk and wool, these tapestries depict scenes from classical civilization. They date from the early 17th century and were based on original designs by the Flemish master Rubens.
The Ormonds acquired these tapestries in the 1670s. They would have been ruinously expensive, but also extremely delicate. They had to be kept out of direct sunlight and placed into storage in the summer months.
Previous generations of Ormonds had used the castle to consolidate power and repel attackers. Now it was supposed to attract attention. Kilkenny Castle had gone from defensive Norman citadel to a restoration chateau. But architecturally, things were about to come full circle. By the early 19th century, the castle was beginning to show its age. The Ormonds wanted to redesign their residence and put their trust in a local architect. The man with the plan was William Robertson. The remodelling began in the 1820s. Robertson was devoted to the Gothic Revival style, which had become fashionable across Europe. He built onto the west curtain wall, essentially a lean-to extension, in order to provide more bedrooms. His most significant intervention was the complete rebuilding of the east wing of the castle into a long picture gallery with characteristic Gothic windows. And he added battlements over the entire building. His design harked back to the castle's medieval past. In fact, one critic remarked that the castle had been modernised within and antiquated without.
But there were other problems with Robertson's work. He left behind leaky roofs and other structural defects. Ultimately, the Victorian architects Dean and Woodward were called in to sort it out. And while they were at it, they designed this spectacular Moorish staircase. With its indoor winter garden, it's beautiful and elegant, but perhaps not quite in keeping with the castle's medieval origins.
The East Wing Picture Gallery was a controversial addition at the time, but today it's a highlight of the castle and the second longest room in Ireland. I've come here to ask Peter Kenny about the significance of this gallery in the overall story of the castle.
So the room is relatively young in comparison to the history of the castle.
It is indeed.
What would it have been used for?
Well, its principal purpose is it was the great picture gallery of the castle, and the Butlers would have saw this as a form of self-aggrandizement, a reflection of themselves and their status and their prestige and history. And it was designed to impress guests. We can only imagine what this room has seen through the centuries. With the entertainment of state guests, there would have been royal banquets, and of course the annual New Year's Ball was a great social occasion within the city itself.
When Robertson designed the room, was it like this or has it changed much?
It has changed substantially. The original ceiling in this roof was a simple flat lead roof, which is probably the worst design decision we can make in an Irish building. This had begun to leak, and the family made the decision to add this beautiful hammer beam truss ceiling, which we believe is made from Norwegian pine.
It's absolutely beautiful. Can you tell me a little bit about the decoration? Because it's very fine and it seems to be really ornate.
It's painted and decorated by one single artist, a gentleman called John Hungerford Pollen. And Pollen was highly influenced by Romantic medievalism. You can see he's borrowed from many different cultures. There's a Scandinavian flavour to this ceiling. There's bits of Anglo-Saxon, and very pertinently we can see Celtic design. And this, I believe, is a narrative on Irish history and design, that we have the three traditions. We have the Scandinavian, which of course is the Viking. We have the Anglo-Norman and of course the Celtic, which are the three great narratives running through our history and culture today.
So in a way, you could say that the ceiling of the room actually tells the whole history of the castle.
It's a reflection of the whole history of the castle in decorative form.
Kilkenny Castle is still very much the heart of the city. But if you peel back the layers, you can reveal centuries of change in architecture and society, in politics and culture. From a simple wooden fort on a hill to the centre of a vibrant modern city. Its form may have changed, but its importance to Kilkenny is just the same as it's ever been.